Hello, everyone. I'm Alan Kozin, and welcome to a show we call Things We Said Today, where we talk about all things Beatles and Beatle-related. Joining me are my regular co-hosts, Ken Michaels, who you may also know from his own radio show, Every Little Thing, Steve Marinucci, who you will know from his columns as the Beatles Examiner and the Examiner of all kinds of other things, and the author of Meet a Monkey, Davy Jones. Al Sussman, who writes for Beatle Fan and is the author of Changing Times, 101 Days That Shaped a Generation. And joining us is our regular guest, Darren DeVivo from radio station WFUV in New York. And today we're going to be talking about John Lennon's Mind Games. No particular reason, just seemed like a nice time to revisit Mind Games. So let's start with Ken. Presumably we've all listened to it this week. What was it like returning to it for you?
Well, I'm never returning to it. It's always in my mind anyway, because most of the Beatles and solo Beatle music I listen to on a regular basis, and the fact that I do a radio show where I mix all the music together, I'm constantly hearing the songs from the solo albums anyway. But Mind Games is an album that I've often thought of as being the most underrated of all of John Lennon's solo albums, for the simple reason that I think every single song on the album is strong. The songs go from good to great. And, it's one of those albums, I'm kind of one of those people that every time an album is overlooked or hasn't been given the credit that it deserves, I kind of try to push that album more into the fore, and I like to give that album more exposure and praise it more. And I think that in John's solo career, people point to the Plastic Ono Band album and Imagine as being, amongst his best. And even in John's own words, he said that, and he even said that Double Fantasy was the next great album or very good album that he released. But I think the music in between Imagine and Double Fantasy doesn't get nearly enough credit. And the Mind Games album, every single song I really like. And that's probably the one thing, the overriding factor about this album. I love every single song on it. And there are very few songs in John's solo career that I don't care for. But, every song on this album, like I said, it goes from good to very strong. And it's got some of the best songs from his solo career, like Out the Blue, which I think is one of the greatest of his love songs. The title track itself, I think, is a masterpiece. It's not only a great song, but it was so well produced. And almost the funny thing about that song that I think about is that this was the first album that John worked on that Phil Spector was removed as a producer, and yet Mind Games, the song, kind of has a Phil Spector feel to it. It kind of has that kind of production. It's more layered, and I do love the whole sound of that particular song. But we'll go deeper into all the songs here. But there's so many great songs, and I really mean great, on this album. I Assume Ascend is one of my favorites of John's solo career. I Know is one of my favorites. You Are Here. In terms of melodies, in terms of lyrics, I think it's extremely overlooked, and a lot of gems throughout this album that I think people should try to appreciate, or if they haven't listened to, try to just investigate that album, because John himself, certainly when he looked back at this period, mainly when he was away from Yoko, when he had a problem with the relationship and he was with May Pang, he kind of wrote that off, that whole period. But between Mind Games and Walls and Bridges especially, there's so much great music that came out of those two albums, and Mind Games isn't given as much attention as Walls and Bridges did. Walls and Bridges was much more of a commercially accepted album, was a #1 album, and Mind Games is kind of forgotten. And the only song that most people would know is the title track. But all the other songs are worth listening to and appreciating, but I would definitely say that this is, it's my personal favorite of John's solo albums, partly due to the fact that it's overlooked and it doesn't get played out like certain songs like Imagine, which is a great song, don't get me wrong. But I tend to like to, give credit to the albums that normally, people pass by and don't give nearly enough credit to. And definitely the most overlooked in John's solo career is Mind Games.
Well, probably the most overlooked track is Utopia National Anthem, which
of course
incredibly well refined some of the ideas that he worked on in 2 Minutes Silence on the great Life with the Lions.
There we go.
Got that in early this time.
Yes, yeah, I was actually thinking about that. I knew there was going to be a correlation there, so there we go.
But he tried to make it a more commercial track than 2 Minutes of Silence. He wanted it to be more concise.
Right.
So that's why we have Utopia National Anthem.
We could do a whole show. We could do a whole show on that.
And the thing is that Utopia National Anthem is always playing somewhere.
Right.
So, Darren, you want to step in next?
Wasn't the Utopian International Anthem released as a single in Nepal, I think?
There's a pressing I have to get.
yes
I agree a lot with what Ken said about Mind Games, and I find it, I've wondered this to myself, why that particular album, and maybe to a lesser extent, or maybe just as much Walls and Bridges, tend to fall through the cracks. I think because Lennon has made so much timeless music and important music, some of it is bound to fall through the cracks. And unfortunately, Mind Games, with only one hit and one song that was heavily played on the radio, was a candidate to be an album that would fall through the cracks as time would go by. A best of collection comes out, and for a while there, it seemed like every other year there was a new John Lennon best of collection coming out. You'd get 1 or 2 or 3 songs from Imagine or Plastic Ono Band, but not Mind Games. And I think in time that perhaps helped the Mind Games album be one of the ones to kind of be forgotten. But I agree with Ken. It is, to me, it's always been, because it has not been held to the heights that Imagine is held. To me, Mind Games is like a poor man's Imagine. It has it's very similar musically in the way the album is structured. He's still writing personal songs. He's not afraid to share a little bit of his political view, but it's sugar-coated, which was intentional on Imagine. It's more commercially palatable. I would actually say you could make the argument that pound for pound, Mind Games might be better than Imagine, but it doesn't have the heavy hitters like Imagine and Jealous Guy on it that that most people will gravitate towards. My personal favorite of Lennon's, if we were doing a show about the albums that tend to get overlooked, my personal favorite's always been Walls and Bridges, with Mind Games kind of right behind it. And one of my favorite John Lennon songs of all time is Meat City, just because it's an off-the-wall rocker. When I was 8 when the album came out, and loved Mind Games, the song. And I had the single. I didn't own the album until years later. But I loved the flip side, Meat City. To this day, I don't quite understand what the song's all about. But the little backwards sound effects in there now, years later, I know the kind of game that John was playing with those noises, those backwards sound effects. I just love that stuff. And more times than not, if you're in the car with me and I'm got the Lennon CDs handy, I'm usually grabbing for Mind Games before Imagine and maybe even Plastic Ono Band, only because Plastic Ono Band's not the kind of album you put on, to sit back and, relax and sing a couple of tunes off key, So it's nice to see Mind Games getting attention in this show, and it's unfortunate that as the years have gone by, it has sort of become a forgotten album. But as I mentioned up top, probably because, it didn't have Imagine or a Jealous Guy to call attention to it.
Mm-hmm. Those are all good points. It's funny, though, Jealous Guy is if you're looking for a beautiful ballad, this certainly has several of them. You know,
You Are Here is another beauty too.
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. And One Day at a Time, Out of the Blue. I mean, there's so much great stuff on here. Steve, do you have a contrarian view tonight?
You say that
What?
like you're expecting one.
Yeah, you do. I'm getting a billing here. Well, now I'm almost afraid to say what I was going to say. I have to say that, my favorite John Lennon solo album is Plastic Ono. Always will be, because I remember wearing that sucker out, wearing the vinyl out on that thing from playing it so much. I am going to be contrarian a little bit. I don't think it's the most forgotten album. I think Walls and Bridges is a little more forgotten than this one. I was struck. It had been a while since I listened to it, to Mind Games, and I was struck at how cohesive this album is. It's incredibly cohesive. Everything just kind of fits together very nicely. I actually listened to I'm not sure what year this reissue was. It had the extra tracks on it. The
2002.
Yeah.
Home demos, and those were interesting too. But really, I mean, the part of the album, the basic album is great. You mentioned One Day at a Time really struck me. I kept thinking of Number 9 Dream when I was sitting there listening to that, and I was actually out walking and listening to Bring on the Lucy, and that really kind of boosted my walk a little bit. Mind Games is a classic. I think it's one of the, it's one of his best songs ever. I agree with the comment about the Spectre sound. There's definitely that there. There's just so many songs here that are really good, and if it's been forgotten, that's a shame, because it is a very cohesive album. There's no real drop off at any point in this album. It's really good.
Okay, Al.
I think basically I'm sort of bouncing off what everybody else is saying. For me, Mind Games is the most consistently satisfying album of John's entire post-Beatles career, because it seemed that with the other albums there was, that Plastic Ono Band was maybe a little too bare wires for the kind of the average audience. And while there was, Imagine had a good deal more polish to it than Plastic Ono Band, still there were things like I Don't Want to Be a Soldier, Mama, that maybe, kind of the average audience member might not be all that well thrilled about. Obviously, Sometime in New York City is not for everybody. Walls and Bridges, certain tracks on it are maybe a little too, given where John was in his personal life at that point. There are some tracks on there that might be a little too dark for some. Some people may not have liked the rearrangements of some of the oldies on rock and roll, and of course there are people that did not appreciate the half Yoko, half John format of Double Fantasy and then subsequently Milk and Honey. So really this album is kind of the one that's, I would say, the most satisfying to not only to me, but to, I'd say, the overall audience, because not only are there some absolutely lovely songs on it, some of the most beautiful ballads of John's entire career, Beatle or non-Beatle, but also some kick-ass rock and roll, tight as, even a little bit of the politics of Sometime in New York City and Bring on the Lucy, and just very commercial, very hook-filled, very accessible songs. I don't think there's a track on here which really could be called, it's just for certain tastes. I'd say it's just overall, it's the most consistently satisfying of all of John's post-Beatles albums.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that leaves me.
Right.
It's funny. I didn't think of it really as John's most neglected album. I think that the case that Ken and Darren made that it might be makes a lot of sense now that I hear it. But we all tend to think of a lot of these albums in terms of our own initial responses to them.
Mm-hmm.
And mine. I was in high school when Plastic Ono and Imagine came out, and I just thought John was, the king of the universe in those days. I was extremely disappointed by Sometime in New York City. It really seemed to be half-baked and not well thought through and not well done. And, I didn't even know how to deal with how disappointed I was, but just sort of listening to other things because, I thought, okay, maybe he's just totally lost it. So when Mind Games came out, it was like, okay, he's back. So I've always thought of Mind Games as something that kind of broke that little slump. I'm not totally sure, nowadays when I listen to Sometime in New York City, I dislike it as much as I did when it came out. But Mind Games was really, okay, he still can write a great song, a lot of great songs, and produce a really well-made album. So I've always thought of it that way, not as neglected, because I hadn't really considered its place in the sort of general world outside me. But that said, I mean, it's been some time since I've listened to it. Sometimes you put these things on and they're just on and you do other things. But over the weekend, I gave it a close listen and almost as if it was new. You realize, of course, there are actually two Mind Games out there. The 2002 version with the bonus tracks is actually a remix. And a lot of people, I don't know, I didn't get to really compare them side by side, but I know that a lot of people were a little upset at the remixes of the early 2000s because it's, okay, these are sacrosanct tapes. Why is Yoko doing this? The tracks that I did compare, the 2010 remasters in the signature box and then available separately, went back to the original mixes. And, maybe it makes sense to have both of them available, as a lot of us do. The tracks that I did compare, I found that the 2002 remix actually had a little bit more punch, and the placements on the few tracks I was able to listen to side by side seemed pretty much the same to me. I mean, I didn't hear any radical transgressions going on there, so I'm not sure entirely what people are upset about. Perhaps they can write into us on Facebook and remind us. But so I listened actually to the 2002 version because I wanted to hear the bonus tracks as well. And I just love it. We already talked about a few of the tracks one day at a time. Listening to it again closely just reminded me of what a great song that is. I mean, it's some of the lines in there. You're the apple and I'm the tree. You're the door and I'm the key. Or is it I'm the door and you're the key? You're the honey and I'm the bee. A lot of those things, I mean, they seem like very simple lines, but to get a whole bunch of them into one basically love song with that kind of imagery is really an achievement. I wasn't as crazy about Tight As and Bring On the Lucy and even Meat City. I kind of liked them, but I was more attracted, at least on this listen, to the slower ballads. I thought that I really liked his melodic sense and the care that he had brought to the lyrics. And I thought, as I think a lot of us often think when we listen to that side of John, why is it that Paul is always regarded as the great ballad writer and John isn't? But, listen to these things. These are great songs. And the rockers did. I mean, I had to admit, Meat City and Tide As, even if I didn't like them as much as the others, they really did have a lot of energy, and there is that side of him that I've always liked as well. So it may have been just hearing it this weekend for some reason. I was more attracted to the other stuff. So that was my experience of it.
Can I jump in about something with in regards to the CD reissues?
Absolutely.
Of not only Mind Games, but of Lennon's catalog as a whole. I don't recall, actually, I don't think I own Mind Games on vinyl. So for a long, long time, I heard it on the original CDs. Mm-hmm. And John's production was so influenced by Phil Spector. You can hear how John grew up and loved that big, echoey wall of sound thing that Spector did. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, Spector's gone by the time Walls and Bridges comes around. I'm sorry, by the time Mind Games comes around. But it still sounds as though he's in the room next door, mm-hmm. Phil Spector. Mm-hmm. Same, maybe slightly to a lesser extent, Walls and Bridges, but you could tell how Spector had an influence on the way John liked the records to sound. He also liked to mess around with his vocal, hit it with a lot of echo, bury it a little in the mix even. So the original CD of Mind Games was really what I heard a lot over the years. And those original CDs all tend to be a little inferior sound-wise.
Right.
And they could make John's production style sound muddy and sloppy even. Mm-hmm. So when the Yoko remasters come out in 2002, it cleaned Mind Games up considerably, and at first it was a revelation to me. But then I thought, I sort of miss the murk that I was used to hearing. But if you listen to what Yoko did with those reissues that, if memory serves correct, started in the year 2000, I think, with Imagine, I think.
I think so.
Mm-hmm. Imagine was faithful to the original. With each series of reissues, Yoko started to take more and more liberties with the packaging and how far she would go in actually remixing the albums. Mm-hmm. Mind Games, to me, I think, is in the middle of that reissue program. By the time Yoko redoes Walls and Bridges and Sometime in New York City, she has taken a lot of liberties with the sound quality, the way the mix is done, even tinkered with it. And, of course, we know how, in the case of Walls and Bridges, she seriously messed around with the artwork and cut Sometime in New York City down to a more palatable single disc. When the reissues came out in 2010, they went back to, the John original mixes, and that was, to me, perfect. Yeah. Because it had some... It cleaned up that murk of those original old discs, but gave me the way John wanted these things to sound. And for me, the 2010 and currently available edition of Mind Games album is the one to listen to, and that goes for all the others. And that kind of ramshackle charm Mind Games had is, again, available and now can be heard in its full glory, because it's that ramshackle kind of sound that I kind of loved about the rock and roll album and Walls and Bridges and Mind Games. He kind of made that, Phil Spector thing his own. So Mind Games, Yoko's mix cleaned it up a little too much, I thought, and removed some of the charm. But if any of that made sense, the 2010 edition is the home run for me.
Yeah, that was the one that I listened to over the weekend as well.
Hopefully that made sense, what I just said, because I confused myself a little.
It did. Like you say, the early CD was really not very good, and that was the case for a lot of the early Beatles solo CDs. Those things were just sort of put out, mastered from what sounded like, an eighth generation submaster with lots of hiss. I remember the first time All Things Must Pass came out, There
Oh,
was
that
a
was
big
horrible.
volume drop in the
Yes.
middle of one of the
Oh,
songs.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they were just a disaster. And and for those of us who are serious about this, it means that how many times have I bought Mind Games? How many times have I bought each one of these? Because you would hear that the British pressing is better, doesn't have
Right.
some of these problems, and so you'd get it, and maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, and then Yoko put out her remixes, and then the 2010 one. So yeah, I think not to if you don't even count the vinyl purchases, we've probably bought all these albums 5 or 6 times each. But they are getting better, as you say. I think the 2010 is the standard edition just because it was John's own mix. But the 2002, I think in the case of Mind Games, I don't think she tinkered all that much, and I kind of like the sharpness of the drums and vocals that are still a bit soft focus on the 2010 version. That may sound contradictory.
These are all great points. I will say that I like both the remixes and the 2010 remasters for different reasons. One thing, I like hearing slight variations in the mix. And I didn't hear too much of it in Mind Games in the remix, although the title track I heard a lot more keyboards than on the original. But no, I enjoy when it's tinkered with a little bit, and the 2010 sound fantastic. But I would like to bring up a question, if I may, and I think a lot of it just has to do with the idea of having hit singles and how that affected the success of Mind Games and possibly how we look back at this album now, because whereas with Imagine, the song was a big hit, number 3 hit in the United States, Mind Games only went top 20. It wasn't the huge hit that it really deserved to be. And perhaps for that reason, there wasn't a follow-up single, although there never was a follow-up single to Imagine either. But there's so many cases where there were solo Beatle albums where you had a big size hit as the first single, and there never was a follow-up single. Like in the case of George Harrison with Give Me Love, which went to number 1, and there never was a second single. And I think that album suffered because of that. Yeah.
There's a lot of that I've wondered for the 4 of them. Why were there no singles off McCartney or Wildlife? Why was there only one single off Living in the Material World? Mind Games, I'm not saying that they were going to be number 1 smashes, but there's candidates for a second and even third single off Mind Games.
Right.
And the other interesting thing is, if I'm not mistaken, Imagine wasn't even released as a single in the United Kingdom.
No.
Initially.
That's right.
I think there weren't any singles off the Imagine album in the UK.
Not until a decade later.
Right. It was in the US that Capitol or Apple or whatever it was just, chose it was a single. Mind Games maybe was hurt by the fact that they didn't take a chance with a song like Out the Blue, maybe. Maybe whoever made those decisions didn't feel like a Lennon ballad was going to, be successful on the charts. I don't know. But, yeah, good point about bringing up the lack of a follow-up single, Ken, Mind Games, because it's something I've wondered myself.
What's interesting about that is that the following year, Elton John took actually one of the songs from the album, One Day at a Time, and released that as the B-side of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Right. And I'm trying to remember if, obviously we know that John is on Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. I'm trying to remember if John was on that version, Elton's version of One Day at a Time. But the fact that it was, and that was at the moment when Elton was indisputably the biggest pop star in the world. And his records were, at that point, were almost every single was an event at that point. So that was actually the fact that One Day at a Time was even a B-side of an Elton single was actually a nice feather in the cap of the material from Mind Games.
Right.
How many other covers are there of Mind Games songs? I can't think of that many. I mean, that was a big one, the Elton one. But,
Yeah.
But who else has done any of these songs?
Probably just in all those various local bands doing John Lennon tribute albums, things like that. But I don't remember, for instance, if there was that Greenpeace benefit album that came out a few years back.
Right.
I don't remember if there were any songs from Mind Games on there.
There was also that, and I could look that up, but there was also that double album that came out on, I think, Warner Brothers that was I know REM was the single, first single. Why am I drawing a blank on that charity album, what the name of it was, and I'm wondering, was that an Amnesty International?
You know what? I think we're talking about the
Benefit.
same album.
We are? Okay, yeah. That may have had a one or two on there because it was a double album.
Unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me.
Actually, I do.
Ah, okay.
I just ran to my CD library here. It's Instant Karma.
Yes.
The campaign to save Darfur. So let me just check here and see if there's any songs from Mind Games that are covered. No, there are no songs on that compilation from Mind Games.
So it's definitely neglected in that way. I mean, people aren't looking to it as a source of material to cover, people who do covers.
Yeah.
That's kind of a shame because there's so much good stuff. I have a feeling that in John's case, a lot of the personalization of the songs may make it seem a little difficult for people to cover. They seem so much about John and what he's going through that it seems almost beside the point to cover them. And yet there are things from Double Fantasy, and those are exactly the same. So don't know what it is.
Do you think that John writing off the whole period when he was away from Yoko influenced the way that the public looks at that period, the Lost Weekend period?
Oh, very much so. Very much so, because especially people who kind of subscribe to the version of the story which comes from Yoko's camp, they do look on that period as one where basically he was just hanging out in Hollywood, getting drunk and getting in trouble and all the rest. And it's May Pang who brings up the fact that during that period they recorded Mind Games and Walls and Bridges and Rock and Roll and produced Harry Nilsson's Pussycats and, on and on. That it was probably the most fruitful period, creatively fruitful period of John's entire post-Beatles career.
It's two ways of looking at it.
Well, I was going to say that I think it's actually more of a stylistic thing. I think people tend to look at McCartney more, as for doing the songs and being able to do romantic. I mean, I think people think of love songs, for example, from McCartney and not from Lennon, even though they should. And I think that's part of the problem. I think it's an image problem, really, more than anything else.
Yeah, the unreconstructed rock and roller,
right,
versus the pop craftsman. That kind of thing, and it is so ironic because you have songs like "One Day at a Time" and "You Are Here" that are absolutely, gorgeous ballads.
And you've had people do, for example, take from the Beatles canon, "In My Life."
Yeah,
there's some great versions of that song.
Sure,
and that's a good example right there. That it could be done with Lennon songs if people would take the time, but I think most people gravitate easily toward McCartney because of who he is and his image. John had the harsher image, and I think that hurts that a little bit. But it was just too bad.
Well, something I just wanted to bring up was this whole idea of the Lost Weekend period, and you think about L.A. Well, the Mind Games album was recorded in New York. It was recorded at the record plant in New York, so that was before that whole thing happened.
That's true.
But it was while the relationship was unraveling with Yoko, so it was the start of that. But still, it shouldn't. I don't know if you should really group it together as part of the Lost Weekend thing.
I think of the Lost Weekend as starting a bit after Mind Games, really.
Yeah, that's fair.
Mind Games was Thursday to the Lost Weekend.
That's right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There we go.
Very good.
Does anyone feel like the commercial fortunes of Mind Games might have been hurt by Sometime in New York City coming before?
Yeah, it
No,
couldn't.
You know,
It didn't help, and also the fact that right around the time Mind Games came out, Ringo's album, Ringo, came out. And obviously, especially the fact that it was the only time that all four Beatles appeared on the same record post group. I think that kind of overshadowed Mind Games. Plus, as well, Band on the Run came out around the same time.
oh yeah, right.
And again, same thing. I think it kind of overshadowed Mind Games. Obviously, it took a while for Band on the Run to really gain some momentum on its own, but I think the combination of those two albums somewhat overshadowed Mind Games.
Does anyone?
So you don't think that the success of one would help the other? The success of the Ringo album, maybe that would help the Mind Games album instead it hurt it?
It seemed to overshadow it. Because of the fact that the big story surrounding that album was the fact that all four Beatles were on it, something which had not happened since the breakup, and as it turned out would never happen again. I think that was, since that's the big story of the album, and the fact that that immediately Ringo had a major hit single from it in Photograph.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think the combination of that and the American McCartney and Wings single of Hell on Wheels and all, I think all of that kind of combined to overshadow Mind Games to some extent. Even though the single had done well, the single of Mind Games did very well. Still, as Ken pointed out, the performance of the album was certainly not up to that of Plastic Ono Band or Imagine, and certainly Sometime in New York City did not help, because there were probably a lot of people who were thinking, this is going to be another bunch of political songs and all, and never really approached it.
Mm-hmm.
Can I make one more random left field observation? Ask the four of you. I don't know how much how much artwork plays into the sale of an album, or back in those days, a picture sleeve. I never felt that the cover of Mind Games was the most attractive album cover. And you could disagree with me. You may disagree with me. I wonder if the commercial fortunes of the album maybe weren't helped by the album cover. Mind Games, John Lennon, very small print in the corner. You're walking by. Again, I was 8 years old at the time when the album came out. I don't recall seeing the album in the stores, although I did have the 45 while it was on the charts. The most obvious feature of the album cover that jumps out at you is Yoko's face in the form of a mountain.
Yes.
Could there have been some people that walked by and thought, "Oh, it's a Yoko album," and walked on, or Yoko's on this album obviously, and after Sometime in New York City, I don't want to go through that again. I don't know if any of that played into some of the thinking of the consumer in 1973.
Having worked in retail at that very moment at Sam Goody, you're right on the money.
Oh wow!
There were absolutely people who would see it and think it was a Yoko album.
Interesting. Okay, because I always wondered that.
Even though the artist listed, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No.
Oh yeah, I mean it would be in the John Lennon bin. But then, they would see the picture of Yoko and immediately put it down, thinking that it was going to be another John and Yoko album, a la, Sometime in New York City, or, the Avant-Garde albums.
And I seem to recall a lot of pushback from that Sometime in New York City album.
Oh, yeah.
Image-wise, back then. There was
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit. It took in fact, it took a long time for that to die down, because that album just really was a, I mean, I think we look at it all a little differently now, but back then it was not appreciated by the general public.
Matter of fact, Wally Podrazik takes a look, kind of a revisionist look, at Sometime in New York City in the on the Beatle fan blog Something New piece that popped about 2 weeks ago. That's really interesting.
Just give us I haven't seen that. Just give us a little bit of what he said.
Well, he basically, it's kind of in a sense a revisionist piece, in that he makes the point that the really heavy politics of it are kind of interesting, almost like as a curio of a particular piece of time. Although the one thing that I was in reading it that I was interested in was the fact that he doesn't mention at any point in the piece Elephant's Memory, and I read it like the Monday after the fest, which was obviously, where Elephant's Memory was very much on our minds because of the fact that, that Gary and Adam had been there, and of course Ken and Darren had interviewed them. But no, there's no mention of Elephant's Memory at all. But it's an interesting piece, as Wally's pieces always are. But it is true that there was, especially at that time, that Sometime in New York City was reviled by a lot of, especially a lot of more hardcore Beatle fans who, just didn't like the political stance, or didn't like Yoko, or various other things about it. And so some of that blowback may have very well have affected Mind Games, even though it was a year and a half later.
I wonder whether Mind Games was a very conscious moving away from the aesthetic of, both in terms of production and the fact that, there's Bring on the Lucy, but otherwise not much political stuff. Mind Games, he was working on that around the same time that Instant Karma came out. There's actually video taken by Tony Cox over a weekend in early February, I guess it was 70. And it shows John actually working on Mind Games, I think on a guitar, sometimes on a piano. And at the time, the lyrics were "Make Love, Not War,"
right.
A little bit of a bit of which survives as the fade out of the song, But he obviously revamped the whole concept, just alluding to the original concept at the end, but it's completely different. And apart from Bring on the Lucy, there's really not much political stuff in there. But I think, it's possible that he felt like, okay, I need to move away from this. This was a dismally unsuccessful album last time, but I still have these feelings that I want to express. And Bring on the Lucy, I guess, is the place where he focused it all.
He definitely wanted to move away from, the political, for the most part, from Sometime in New York City. I remember Gary Van Sock telling me several times that John was devastated at the lack of success of Sometime in New York City. And also, apparently, the one-to-one concert was given fairly poor reviews the day after. And John, I think John was baffled by this whole thing. So he not only dropped Elephant's Memory, but he stopped associating himself with the political figures of that time. He was also very affected by the fact that Richard Nixon won the re-election. So he was moving away from that whole thing, and he needed some time to recharge. And I think he probably was thinking he had to return to something closer to an Imagine type album. So I think that's why you have the songs that you do have on Mind Games, with the exception of, like you said, Bring on the Lucy.
And also, by that point, also the immigration fight had really begun.
Right.
Because of the fact that Nixon had been elected to the second term, and the effort to get John out of the country really kind of went into high gear at that point.
Perhaps Mind Games was Lennon's reaction to Sometime in New York City in a similar way that, from what I've read, John's reaction, or how Imagine was a reaction to Plastic Ono Band. Plastic Ono Band was such a bare bones, tough, non-radio record.
Yes.
John thought, okay, I got it now. If I put some sugar on all of this and sweeten it up a bit, and then the result is Imagine. Then he goes and does a raw rock and roll political album like Sometime in New York City, and he goes, okay, I'm going to have to sweeten the pot again for my next effort, and the result is, again, a more sugar-coated album in Mind Games.
I guess that blows the theory that I had that John was pretty much a non-commercial guy, because from what Ken said and from what you just said, Darren, obviously that's not true, because I somehow find that John being that commercially, motivated to be somewhat of a contradiction.
I would agree with you. I would think
John had those warring impulses in him, commercial, non-commercial, love songs, rockers, that. Sorry, Darren, go ahead.
No, that's all right, Alan. I was going to say I could see John being the kind of person that didn't care if he had a number one hit or not, but then he's got Paul and George on either side of him, soaring up the charts, and it's like you maybe feel a little left out here and go, wait a minute. And, he puts out Plastic Ono Band and it doesn't hit number one. It's a raw record. McCartney was a raw record. McCartney was a number one. It didn't have any singles. I did a raw album. I put a single out. My record didn't do that well. You know what? What do I have to do here to, play this game? Why don't I put some strings and put a ballad here and Imagine the result? And the same thing with Mind Games. All right, give them the strings and a couple of ballads, and Mind Games happens.
Right.
Oh yeah, he was very much a creature of the, the music business. He paid a lot more attention to the music business than I think he kind of let on. And he was
also, also remember that while John didn't have the commercial success that Paul did, it's like the first album, McCartney went to number one, like you said, Darren, but John had more of the creative, the music press embraced him early on more than they did Paul, who was looked upon as being the bad guy, that was responsible for breaking up the Beatles, especially after watching Let It Be.
Right. It's interesting.
Yeah, there were periods there, especially like in the first half of the 70s, when it seemed like one Beatle would be considered cool and one wasn't quite a bit, and it changed a great deal. In 1970, George was probably the most popular of the four, and yet by the end of 74 with the Dark Horse tour, he was very much on the outs with kind of the media and at least some of the public. And John had much the same type of up and down conventional wisdom turmoil, and certainly Paul did. It took Paul until really 73 and into 74 before he really kind of returned to the good graces, so to speak, of the certainly of the the rock press and even some of the his constituency, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of interesting to think, do we really feel that the four Beatles were looking over each other's shoulders at every given moment, at every new release? Were they that concerned? Were they competing with each other? Or were they just really supporting each other?
I think at that point they probably certainly were competing with each other, because that was also the period when there was the most dissension, all of the post-breakup Sue You blues, dissension, How Do You Sleep, all that stuff. And so and the fact that even when they were together as a group, there was competition within the group. Certainly by that point in the early 70s, they were very, very much competitors.
Yeah, I think it was pretty clear from things John said over the years in interviews that he was always very conscious of what Paul was doing, and that also he and the others were very conscious of what Ringo was doing in the sense that they always wanted to lend a hand when they could.
Yeah.
Not sure how everybody else felt about George's stuff. We know Ringo played on some of it, early on, but there doesn't seem to be that kind of back and forth. George seems to have been really the odd man out, really not caring that much commercially about what was going on, putting out albums and actually in one case having one rejected by his record label because it wasn't commercial enough, and responding by writing Blood from a Clone,
Yeah. And also there was that whole, during that much of that period, there was a good deal, there was maybe even more personal intrigue between George and John than there was even between Paul and John. There was a good deal of bad blood there.
Yeah.
So that may be part of why it seemed that Ringo was the one kind of constant in, along with, his own kind of coterie of players, the Gary Wrights and Billy Prestons of the world, that were, more the part of George's records than the other Beatles.
It's a fascinating angle to look at whether or not we feel that each of the four Beatles cared that much about their own success, because it's varying degrees, I think, with each one of them. And certainly in the case with John and George, they're probably the most complicated.
Yes.
Because I think in the case of George, I think, like Patty Boyd said to us, I think he was taken aback by the success of All Things Must Pass. I don't think he was expecting that at all. And yet I think he was very proud of the success of that album. And then he had the concert for Bangladesh, and Living in the Material World was a #1 album. He had, I think, by the time the mid-'70s happened, he had enough success to satisfy his ego, to the point where, he would still continue to make new albums. And if they sold, fine. If they didn't, that's okay. He wasn't really in the business so much to be #1 or to have top 10 hits. I don't think it mattered as much to him, because I felt that he felt that he proved himself. But John you never knew about, because, he'd make comments like, if you want to, go follow the Rolling Wings.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And yet I think that, with Paul continuing to have success in Wings, and in 1980, he commented about Coming Up and the fact that he liked the song. And it was a #1 hit that year. Maybe there was a little bit of jealousy there, and maybe that spurred him on a little bit to go back into the studio and to do some recording again. It was also the right time after 5 years of being away.
Right.
But, I think it mattered to John in some degree, and in other ways it didn't.
And he was, he was so complicated. There were so many dimensions to John Lennon. I've always said that he was kind of almost like an onion, where you've got to peel away all of these layers, and also the fact that he, he could play fast and loose with, his opinions, where, he might say one thing, just maybe even just for the shock value of how it would look in print, and might, 2 weeks later say something totally different.
That's right.
And you didn't know, what was the real, his real feeling.
It's true.
I know. He's one of the most complicated figures to figure
Absolutely.
out, because, like you said, he changed his opinions as often as he changed his clothes.
Yeah.
And if you studied all the interviews that he did, one moment he'll be dead set against a Beatles reunion, and then around 1974 he was kind of warming up to it a little bit, so you didn't really know how he felt. He'll be attacking Paul McCartney in one interview, and then the next interview he'll say he's the best bass player, or one of the best bass players. He'll give him some kind of praise in another interview. So he knocked the Rolling Stones in the
certainly the Rolling Stone interview, the Lennon Remembers interview, mix a joke with his, pardon the expression, with his fag dancing, quote unquote.
But around 1974, he was saying, people make fun of the Stones, but give them credit for weathering the storm.
See?
So it's just the same man saying two completely different things. So you never quite knew where he stood.
Right.
But every time he spoke with such conviction that you believe what he was saying, but that's how he felt in the moment. So, he's a very tough person to figure out.
That's true.
Very awesome.
So, guys, our hour is cruising towards an end, and I was wondering if we wanted to, if you each wanted to make some sort of a closing comment about the album. We've covered so much of it, but anything left unsaid that you had intended to get to? Start with Darren.
The difference between the single mix of Meat City and the album mix. Does anyone know the little backwards messages that John put in that song?
No. Do you? Can you tell us?
The B-side version of Meat City, the single version, which was the B-side to the song Mind Games, the first, it's been a long time since I played them backwards and checked them out on tape, but the one of the little squeaky voices in the middle of Meat City, John saying, or someone saying, check the album. And then when you listen to the album mix of Meat City, the backwards message, the little backwards voice sounds different. And when you play that back, it's, I won't say the word, but it's F a pig is what it says, which is pretty funny. Little subtle joke that John put in there on that song.
I should actually take this opportunity to plug Chip Mattinger's project that's coming up.
Yes.
For a lot of these kinds of details about the different mixes and what went into them and what was going on with John at the time and studio information, Chip Mattinger's Lennonology is nearing completion. It should be out on October 9th, John's birthday. And if you're into this kind of detail, that's going to be the place to look. So Al,
and certainly
comments?
with Chip's track record through the book 8 Arms to Hold You that he did with Mark Easter, just on that record alone, this should be really, really good. Yeah. No, I'd say nothing other than what I was saying before. Just that again, I would say that it's, for me, it's the most commercially, or not commercially, but it's the most consistently satisfying, at least for me as a listener. It's the most consistently satisfying to me of all of John's post-Beatles work.
Steve?
I was just looking in a book called Every Little Thing by Mitch McGeary.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And it mentions that there were different versions with different running times of Mind Games issued. I mean, it sounds like they're only 2 seconds difference. It says the original track was 4:10, then it was reissued on Shaved Fish with 4:12, even though the track ran 4:10, and then on the John Lennon collection, it said it was listed at 4:20, but it was actually 4:12. So, anyway.
Okay.
If you listen to the very, very last split-second fade-out of the song Mind Games, and I don't know where you'll find the differences, you can hear that there was some sort of reverb, percussion reverb that was removed on one of the CDs that you hear on the single. I forget, but there is some sort of slight tinkering done by somebody.
Actually, I thought I heard a little bit on the because I listened to the 2002 CD, and I thought I heard a little bit at the beginning, not at the end.
There could be something there too, like the beginning of Hold On John on Yoko's Plastic Ono Band mix, as opposed to the original. The guitar intro is slightly different.
Yeah.
So however these things happen,
Right. Yeah, because I noticed when I was listening to it through headphones, I could hear something at the beginning, and then it went into the song. So, yeah. But anyway, that's I mean, I don't have anything else to say, other than what we've already said. So.
And Ken?
Well, a couple things. First of all, I believe it was Darren talking about this, about whether or not the songs on Mind Games are represented elsewhere. And there was a great compilation that came out, forget the year, it was about 10 years ago, called Working Class Hero.
Oh,
and
yes.
It was a double CD.
Yes.
And, for people who love the hits of John's solo career but want to go a little bit deeper, and they don't want to buy all of his CDs, this is the perfect collection.
Yeah.
Because apart from the hits, you go into certain select album cuts, and it's a good spread amongst all of his solo albums. And you do have, in addition to the title track to Mind Games, you do have Out the Blue on this collection. You do have Intuition on here, and you also have You Are Here on the collection. So it was not ignored on Working Class Hero.
I'm thinking of you know what I'm thinking of is there was a Working Class Hero tribute album.
Yeah.
Right.
It was done.
Oh.
And actually, that's more than 10 years ago. That's about 20 years ago now.
Right.
The album that had Mary Chapin Carpenter's version of
Right.
Grow Old With Me. I'm thinking of something totally different. Never mind.
I'm pretty sure that the Working Class Hero, the definitive Lennon, which is the full title,
Yes.
is the double anthology that Ken is referring to. It's the Yoko mixes, and it's out of print. You can't get Working Class Hero any longer, so you'd have to seek out a used copy or get it on eBay or something, because I think when the 2010 reissues came out, Working Class Hero anthology was kind of phased out in favor of the Power to the People single disc best of.
Okay.
Which has the John mixes anyway.
Right. The other thing I wanted to say was, I've known Al now for well over 30 years, and I certainly didn't know that you felt this strongly about the Mind Games album being so consistently strong. I'm really pleased to hear you say that, because it has to be my favorite Lennon album, in part because I do feel it's overlooked. And I do recall that when the album came out, I don't remember radio playing anything other than the title track.
No.
And whereas other solo Beatle albums from 73 and 74, you heard album cuts on the radio besides the singles. I never remember hearing anything other than Mind Games.
I think that, a Scott Muni, who was particularly a Lennon fan file, whatever you want to call it, I think he did play things like One Day at a Time and maybe a couple of others, but really, for the most part, it was just Mind Games.
Yeah, but if you take a look at this entire album, it is strong from start to finish. And I like the fact that you guys brought up the ballads here, because John, I really hate stereotypes. And like you said, John is known for being the rocker and Paul wrote the love songs, but actually John could write just as great a love song as Paul, and Paul could write just as great a rocker as John. And, certainly on the Mind Games album, Out the Blue, I think, is one of the greatest love songs I think he's ever written. And I Know is one of my favorites. You guys mentioned One Day at a Time. Really good stuff. I Assume Ascend is actually a favorite of mine because it's such a good, powerful, bluesy number. And David Spinoza, who's one of the great studio guitarists, he did the lead guitar solo on that song. And I remember going back to my days in New Jersey radio when I had him as a guest, and he talked about that song. And that guitar solo was done in one take. And so, the perfect guitar solo really made a difference in that song right there. I love it. And Intuition is a favorite of mine. I probably would have chosen that as a second single. It kind of had that circus atmosphere in the middle, which reminded me a little bit of Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. That's just what my ears picked up anyway.
Yeah.
And You Are Here is gorgeous. Oh, God, the whole album is just wonderful. I Know is a personal favorite of mine. Also because of the bass playing that's on that song, which really made a difference. Gordon Edwards was the bass player. He was a great studio bass player. And listen to what he adds to that song. It's very memorable. It's a very big part of that song if you listen to I Know.
Only People, which I don't think any of us have brought up, which is a wonderful song.
By the way,
So,
Working Class People is available through Amazon in the U.S. You can get it. There's a couple of importers that have it, and there's one American dealer that has it without the booklet. But for a complete copy with a booklet, it runs about $20, but you can get it if you're interested.
Okay, so I guess that wraps it up for this week. I thought it was a lot of fun revisiting that album, and now that we've discussed it all, I'm going to go listen to it again because, and not to mention the single of Meat City to hear the alternate backwards track. So we will come up with another fascinating topic next time, and for Ken Michaels, Al Sussman, Steve Marinucci, and Darren DeVivo, I'm Alan Kozin saying goodbye and good luck from Things We Said Today.